Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
And today we're going to get into the true crime case that will most certainly take your breath away.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, and your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it.
So the one thing that MD and I want to do on season 7 is highlight a lot more cases that are unsolved, and they need attention from true crime podcasters so that hopefully they can get. Today we bring you the heartbreaking story of Tioni Theus, a young girl whose life was filled with promise and tragedy. At just 16 years old, Tioni had already experienced more than most adults could imagine.
Tioni Theus was born on July 18th, 2005 in Compton, Cali. She grew up with her mother, Teresa, and her 2 older brothers. She was the youngest, but she was the only daughter, and she was cherished by her family. Tioni had a passion for music. She loved to play golf, and she loved to dance. As a matter of fact, she was a part of a golf program that offered scholarships to Ivy League universities. Like, they were known to do that.
Yeah, you know what? I just want to talk for a second. That is something that I feel like a lot of Black people are starting to get into. Golf,
Yeah.
you know? Like, one of my son's friends' mother told me how, there are a lot of scholarships, as you just said, and I think that's amazing.
Absolutely. It's a world of, and when I say world, a sports world that we're not typically used to being a part of.
Right.
Much like tennis, even though we have our, athletes like Venus and Serena, but typically it's golf and tennis and, but it's nice to know that these types of sports are being offered to, individuals that typically wouldn't take part of it for reasons of like finances, or it's just not, easily accessible. Well, Tioni's mother made sure that she had access to this sport and particularly this program. And she was well on her way to fulfilling her dreams. Not only was she good in sports and music, but she excelled in school. She was consistently bringing home A's and showing leadership qualities that her teammates, her teachers, and her coaches absolutely adored. However, Tioni's life was not without hardship. When she was just 7 years old, one of her brothers went to jail. And then at the age of 11, her oldest brother was tragically shot and killed at the age of 19. Now, despite a lot of these challenges, her mother, Teresa, was her rock. And she ensured that Tioni, even though she experienced these hardships, had a typical normal childhood as much as she possibly could. But everything changed in 2019. Tioni was visiting her aunt and her cousin while her mom attended an event. But Tioni needed to grab the keys from her mom so she could get back into her home. So her older cousin drove her to meet her mom at this event. Now, as they approached the event, they saw a body lying in the street. And Tioni, her aunt, recounted this experience. She said, and I quote, "There was blood everywhere, and Tioni said to my daughter, 'That's my mother.' My daughter tried to tell her it wasn't, but Tioni insisted, 'Yes, it is. I know her purse, and I know her shoes.' So then my daughter calls me screaming, 'Something happened to Teresa.' That's a lot for a 13-year-old girl." And that was her aunt's recollection of the events. It was a very traumatic experience. Her mother was hit in a hit-and-run car accident and was left in a coma. She was rushed to the hospital, but she was left in a coma. And then after they were finally able to get her stabilized, they ended up transferring her to a long-term care facility where she remains to this day.
What do you think about experiencing tragic events so early in life when you haven't even fully developed your own personality? You're still struggling to find yourself. How does that shape you?
I think that it absolutely shapes, like traumatic events, no matter what the age, right, shapes your future, right? Like it's like I was on this path and then this trauma happened and then everything is life after that traumatic, insert traumatic event here, right? And I think that it's even more realized or even more dramatic, so to speak, for someone whose brain hasn't even fully developed, like a 13-year-old. And so for her to have already had some quote unquote traumatic events, some hardships in her life, and then to have to to witness what happened to her mother is life-altering. What are your thoughts?
I mean, for sure. I think obviously losing your brothers at such a young age is traumatic, but it seemed like her mom was her main caregiver. And so to go from, you know, you doing everything with your mom, she's still making everything super normal for you in a way because that's just what moms do, to, just being completely devastated by, having to recount what she literally saw and then having to come to grips with the fact that her mom, whether she woke up from the coma or not, would most likely never be the same. Tioni then went to stay with her grandparents, who tried to provide her with stability. Unfortunately, both grandparents were diagnosed with cancer shortly after she moved in. Tioni just cannot catch a break. This is insane. While they grappled with their diagnosis, Tioni moved between various family members. Within a year, both grandparents passed away, adding to Tioni's immense loss. Like many teenagers and adults, Tioni turned to social media to express her feelings of being lost, sad, lonely, and hopeless. And we say often here that I like to think of it is that social media is a lot like people's diaries,
Absolutely, and people use it like a diary. And the only difference is usually your diary is something that you don't share with anybody else. But now you're just like, whoever can see it, can see it.
And so she did that. And after her grandparents passed away, Tioni eventually moved to Los Angeles to live with her father, Darian. This was a difficult transition for her. She was leaving behind everything familiar, her friends and family. As a result, she began to rebel, going from straight A's to ditching school, running away from home, and receiving failing grades. Her relationship with her father was obviously strained. He had rules, she didn't want to follow them, typical teenage behavior. Darian, who often worked late nights, noticed she was struggling but couldn't provide the balance she needed. So, MD, what do you think about that transition that she had to go through?
I think it's always hard when you don't have stability. Children need consistency and they need stability. And it's not something that you like, even if you're not a person who is type A and very structured, you have to understand that children thrive in that type of environment. Whether their personality is like that or not, they're most successful in those types of environments. Part of the reason why she did so well when she was with her mom was because it was consistent, it was stable, it was structured, structured on a line, right? It's linear, right? Some people's structure is way more structured than others, but even still, it was consistent. Here now we find Tioni being thrown into a world of chaos, right? It's like, I don't really even know where I'm going to be staying. First, she was with her grandparents, and that was probably going to offer her the best level of stability. But then they were diagnosed with cancer. And then she started to kind of float, like I'm going from family to family, until she finally got to her father's house, who, even though that may have offered some level of stability, was completely different from what she was used to, because it was not just, I'm going to another family member's house. It was, I'm moving away from Compton. I'm moving away from my school. I'm moving away from my golf program. I'm moving away from everything that I knew that provided me with structure and stability. And I think it's just difficult to have to make that type of a transition, whether a teenager like Tioni or you're grown.
Not to mention, she was also having to deal with her emotions, that her mental health was failing. Regardless if she stayed in Compton or went to LA, it didn't seem like she had much assistance there as well. On social media, Tioni's posts reflected her struggles. She often would post videos of herself partying, drinking, smoking. Her father recounted to the police and news outlets that she would sometimes call him to rescue her from dangerous situations that arose while she was out partying.
January 7th, 2022, Tioni visited her dad's job and told him about her plan to go to a party with a friend in Inglewood. A family member confirmed that a young woman picked Tioni up that day, but she doesn't know who that young woman was. She wasn't able to say where they were going or even what kind of vehicle that they were driving. Despite her father's unease, and he told her, I don't want you to go, Tioni decided to go anyway. And the last thing he said to her was, I love you, and he gave her a hug. Now, what happened next is unclear. We don't know. So this is just speculation from what the police have been able to gather. Tioni had been meeting older men on social media. So her whereabouts after leaving were unknown. We don't know who she was with, where she was going, and where she was meeting up at. The police were never able to find or substantiate a party that was occurring in Inglewood. But at 8 a.m. on January 8th, the police began receiving calls about a person that was lying on the 110 freeway near the Manchester on-ramp. And so when the investigators arrived, they found Tioni's body with 2 gunshot wounds. And she had been shot and thrown from her vehicle.
Upon hearing about Tioni's death, her father was devastated. Just 4 years earlier, he had lost his son to gun violence, and now his daughter had met the same fate. Several days before local media picked up the story, the police didn't seem to prioritize her case. Information began to surface that she was a prostitute, and this turned Tioni into a non-sympathetic victim, but she was a minor. So this wouldn't be prostitution. This would be trafficking. She was a victim. This did not stop people from tearing Tioni's past apart and attempting to paint her as someone who deserved what she got. And I just want to say that aside from her being Black, right, obviously that plays a major part in why the police didn't immediately pay attention to her case. But I also think that people just have this perception that, oh, she was fast, she was out there, so you get what you get.
You know, I remember, Steph, growing up and hearing men say, well, she wore that. That was a thing. Yeah. That was a real thing back in the 90s of, she had that short skirt on. So, what did she expect? What do you mean, what did she expect? We're not going to victim blame here and
Absolutely
make this be a part of what they did or didn't do. And even bigger than that, right? Mm-hmm. She was a minor. She was 16 years old. And so there is in no world does this even make sense, Absolutely. Right?
And if you truly believe that all life has value, then you don't do that type of stuff. Like, you don't victim blame, right? Like, because there has been cases that we have covered where men would prey on Black prostitutes and kill them because they felt like, well, they're prostitutes, nobody's gonna miss them. No, scratch that. They have value and worth because they were made by the Creator, period. I don't care what they were involved in.
Right, hard stop here, right? Whether life was, they were doing something illegal or immoral or whatever, like, at the end of the day, nobody deserves to be killed.
So, as people began to kind of paint this narrative, it just really speaks to how disgusting it was. And as we just said, it's not prostitution, it was human trafficking. And we know a couple of things about human trafficking. It often happens to Black girls. And if you didn't know that, I remember on TikTok, it was like this thing on social media where back during COVID, like, you had to watch your car and be careful not to pull on your door handle and all those type of things. And a lot of the women, we personally know someone who was trafficked here in Dallas. And it happens more than you think. So human trafficking is a serious crime and a grave violation of human rights. It involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons through force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of exploitation. This exploitation can take many forms, including forced labor, sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, and other forms of modern slavery. So there's a couple of key components here that I'm going to mention. One is recruitment. Traffickers often recruit victims through deception, promises of employment, education, or a better way of life. They may also use force or coercion. So we mentioned that she was online meeting up with guys and probably had really innocent intentions meeting up with these men and got sucked in. The second point is transportation and transfer. Victims are often moved from their home regions to other areas or countries, sometimes illegally and sometimes illegally. Exploitation is the next point. The ultimate goal of trafficking is to exploit victims for various purposes, including sex trafficking, labor trafficking, organ trafficking. Lastly, traffickers use various methods to control their victims, including physical violence, threats, psychological manipulation. So I'm just giving you guys a brief overview of what really happens with human trafficking. And if you don't know, we want to be informative here on our podcast and let you know what can actually happen and what human trafficking means, because we use words often in our culture, but we really don't know the meaning behind it. So we want to give you the news you can use.
And she was trafficked, and she really fit a lot of those components that you described, the recruitment, she was transferred, right? We don't know where, but we know she ended up on the highway. She was exploited. We don't know if it was for sex or labor, but we know that she was definitely exploited. But 10 days after her murder, Tioni's family held a rally where family members and police officers spoke about the devastation of her death. And activists made a demand for a reward leading to information about her killer. The response to her case was really frustrating for her family, especially compared to another victim in the same area named Brianna Cupper, who was white and whose case quickly garnered a $250,000 reward. So this really just brings us full circle for why we have this podcast, right? Like the reason why we focus on cases involving people of color, but specifically black people, because when it comes to black victims, we usually disregarded or we don't garner the same amount of attention as our white counterparts. Because here with Brianna Cupper, she was a victim, and obviously her crime needed to be spread, and obviously we needed to find her killer, and obviously what happened to her was absolutely devastating. And she was able to get a $250,000 reward just like that. But her case happened after Tioni. And yet Tioni couldn't even get $1. Like, we couldn't even get the police or the community to rally financially for her case. And so it just shows the dynamic between black victims and their counterparts. Now, Tioni's family struggled to get the same recognition and the same resources that other people with a similar crime would get. But Project Hope made a direct appeal to the city and state officials for the reward, because what I understood, Steph, and maybe you have understood this from previous cases you've covered, is that those rewards, yes, they can come from family, but most often they come from the city and state officials. So it's not something that, only family can contribute to.
Absolutely. Like, family can, and they do accept that. Most certainly, it's the state that usually comes and rallies behind the community that supports the state. It just kind of
makes sense. So on January 26, a $110,000 reward was finally posted, and it was provided by local officials, and it showed that Tioni's life had meaning, it had value, and she mattered. A few weeks later, the police announced that they believed her murder was connected to human trafficking due to the area where Tioni's body was found, because it was an area that was known for prostitution.
In a press release, Tioni's uncle expressed a sentiment shared by many. "We could have done better by Tioni. Her murder remains unsolved with few credible leads." In April of 2022, the reward was raised to $120,000, but no new information has emerged. A year after her murder, the case remains cold, and the family did another rally and press release just to remind the community there that they were still grieving, they still wanted answers, they still wanted justice for Tioni.
Now, Tioni's story is a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that many black girls face, and specifically the systematic failures that often hinder justice for cases like these. Her life, filled with promise, was tragically cut short, And as we remember Tioni, we must advocate for better protections and justice for all victims of trafficking and violence. Now, this case, like Steph said, is still unsolved. So if you have any information relating to the death of Tioni Theus, we ask that you please contact local officials at 323-644-9557. We will put that number in the show notes. Her case is still ongoing, and the police are still investigating it. But if you have any idea or you have any thought of something that could relate to her crime, let's try to get this solved.
Let's go ahead and go into our takeaway. So I'm going to go first. I really think this case highlights a couple of things. One, you never know what a person is going through. Often when we see bad kids, quote unquote, bad kids, we are quick to blame their parents, obviously, or to just, write it off really quickly. And I think we shouldn't do that. I had caught myself doing that with a little boy in my son's class, and I had to say, I don't know what he's going through at home. I really don't. Like, he could be going through hell, and that's why he comes to school and he acts out. So I think that we have to be kinder, because they were quick to pull up her past. And, but if you knew the intricacies of her life, you would understand why she was rebelling. So I think we just need to be kind to one another. I think that as a society, I think we need to put more emotional things in place in school for kids. I think there are a lot of resources now, like they have a school counselor, but I think we really deprive our kids of emotional support. I'm thinking about In and Out. Okay, don't come for me. But, just intricacies of your emotions and what you go through and how do you grieve and how do you experience loss? And some of these things are not talked about at home. So you have to bring it over to the school space. And I just think that the community failed Tioni. I think everyone did in a large part. And so that's my takeaway.
That's a great takeaway, Steph. I think just to kind of piggyback on your takeaway, when I saw the article that discussed her uncle saying we could have done better by Tioni, I thought that was such an amazing sentiment that he said as a family member, right? And it just shows the accountability. And one of the things that I strive do in my personal life, teach my children, is to have a level of accountability, to always be able to look back and say, what could I have done better? What could I have done different? And I think that reflective mindset was there with her uncle. And the truth of the matter is that yes, the community failed her. Yes, there were things that, resources and things that should have been offered to her. But I really think the family also, in a sense, failed her. And I don't say this with judgment, right? Because, I am not a perfect mother. I do not have it together. But I think that when she lost her rock, when she lost her mother, and although her mother is still alive, she lost her mother. She lost what her mother was in her life. She lost the stability that her mother provided for her. I think that her family needed to have rallied in a different way. And even if it was something that they could not do, because I don't mean so I'm going to let you come stay with me, because that's not always the answer. I may not have the ability to allow you to stay with me, but maybe I make sure you get the resources you need to be able to grieve properly. And a lot of times, we as family members fail our family members, our children, our cousins, our aunts, our uncles, because we don't even know the tools and the resources that we need to give them, or we don't even know where to get it for our own selves, let alone for them. But the truth of the matter is that she needed help. She needed help, and she was crying out for help in the way that a 16-year-old cries out for help. When you see a child go from getting all A's to all of a sudden failing, to not showing up for class, to skipping. When you see a person, like a child, go from being loving to be involved in sports to not wanting to have anything to do with a sport, that is a red flag. That is a siren, them screaming, I need help. I don't know what to do. I am struggling to get through. We as adults don't know how to deal with our own emotions sometimes, let alone a child whose brain has yet to fully develop. And so I think, my takeaway here is not in a judgmental manner, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm like ripping the parents and the family to shreds. But I think it's important that we look and take accountability and be reflective so that we don't find ourselves in the same situation, right? And so I just think that it's important to be able to say, I need to be paying attention. I need to go the extra step, do the extra thing so that I can ensure that my loved one, family, friend, gets the help that they need.
Absolutely. I hate that I say absolutely so much, but I really do mean it. I really do mean it.
Absolutely.
But I agree. I think, that's what our takeaway is all about. When we finish up a story that is tragic and that is so disheartening, what we as the living can take away from it so that we can do better for our families and our communities going forward. So that's the case of Tioni Theus. We hope you guys have enjoyed. Make sure you participate with the polls that we will put up and the questions. Comment about this episode. Tell us what you think, even if it's contradictory of what we think. That's totally fine.
We love that. We love that
to have
dialogue.
discussions. So hopefully if you know anything about Tioni's case up there in LA or wherever you may be, please, please, please contact the local police there. So until next time, this is Murder in the Black.